Hey Peter, welcome to the Changemakers podcast. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm good, Dave. Happy to be here. Nice to see you again.
And you, yeah, I know this has been a long time coming. We've been talking for a while, so I'm so excited that we finally got the chance to do this. And it's episode number 50 of the Changemakers, which, personally, I'm amazed that we even got to five, let alone 50.
Yeah,
Um, but, we've stuck at it and yeah, really, really proud of that. And also, um, blowing our own trumpet as well. This is the first episode in the Changemakers Shiny New podcast studio, which is a kind of
nice.
a meeting pod here in the studio, but also doubles up as a podcast studio as and when I can grab it. So, yeah, it's an honor on that subject, but also it's a great honor to have you on the podcast, especially talking about motion design and motion systems, because I know this is something that you've worked tirelessly for so much of your career and so passionately to progress forward. So really, really exciting to be talking about this with you today. And actually, I'd love to just dive straight in if it's okay with you, because we've
Yeah,
got
of
so
course.
much to talk about. We could talk all day about this subject. And I'd really, really like to start somewhere that's pretty fundamental, I know, to your work, but also to motion in general for brands, which is I'd love to start with a look at the fundamental difference between one-off motion design and much more holistic motion systems. Could you just start by explaining that for us?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I think depends. People come to it from different places. I guess as a motion designer, historically, that's how I came to thinking about motion systems was through motion design. But I think for me, what I've been thinking about recently is kind of like what is that fundamental difference between motion design and having a motion system? To me, it's to do with kind of the difference between strategy and like not having a strategy. I guess with motion design, it's fundamentally a subjective practice. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of if I'm a motion designer and I'm responding to a creative brief or a design, like a set of designs for a campaign that we're building, I'm kind of what I'm bringing to that is my kind of own personal journey with motion. How I do easing, how I kind of feel how things should move. So I'm bringing this kind of subjective approach to how we do it, and that I think that way of working does really work, especially in a kind of creative campaign building situation where clients got a particular brief that they need to deliver on, and they bring in a motion designer and they kind of start to kind of figure out what that feels like. And I think I think that's why in some respect motion design is kind of safe, because I think that subjective layer is going to be continue to have a value for building out creative and delivering campaigns. So I guess with the systematic approach, it's kind of like taking away that subjectivity and kind of trying to think about motion more strategically, so it's less about how I want something to move, but more how it should move for the brand. So it's kind of trying to move. It's actually shifting motion up the stack a little bit more. So it's no longer kind of at the end of the chain being a deliverable. So you've got strategy, creative, design, motion. That's the kind of traditional kind of like stack. And so by the time you get to design, all the kind of strategic thinking is kind of in place, and it's now in a more of a creative space. Whereas thinking about building a system, you're trying to like get the brand to think about how you move and how that reflects who you are. So it's kind of taking it. It's not even really thinking about easing or timings or anything like that. It's more like, what do you represent as a brand, and how does that show up through motion? So it's laying out a strategic approach to it. And there's kind of different methodologies, and different people have different ways of kind of developing that. But yeah, I've kind of spent a bit of time just thinking about the best approach to setting that up. So yeah, so just a very different. So I guess it's subjective versus objective. The objective goals of that brand and making sure that the motion aligns versus the subjective principles that I just lean into naturally as a motion designer. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. And I also like the fact that it also just feels much more long term. So
Yeah,
it's effective. This is something that we're putting in place for the long term. It's for consistency. This is going to elevate your brand over time, because we're building consistent systems in rather than just doing everything on a kind of a one-off basis. Would that be fair to say as well?
100%. I think that's like one of the kind of clear objectives of having a motion system is actually the kind of value after the system. You know what I mean? The legacy of the system. It's like you can build a motion system, you can build templates and guidance for that system, but then if it doesn't actually show up, you know, properly, or people don't use it or don't align to it properly, then that can fall by the wayside. So that consistency, that kind of automative approach to building motion is definitely going to help a brand kind of deliver consistently over time rather than just for that one occasion. So yeah, it's how you approach building that in a robust way so you can able to continue to do that.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it seems a little bit obvious to me, but I'd just love you to clarify. I mean, why is it so important in today's world? Why is it so important to have that distinction between one-off kind of motion design and a more fundamental motion strategy in place for modern brands?
I think what it does is it builds a level of trust between you and your audience or your users if you're kind of like a more of a digital product kind of, and it allows you to build a connection with your audience which they they start to have a relationship with you because when you show up with motion as a brand and you're showing up, I don't know, in kind of digital out of home space or in social or in a paid campaign somewhere, if you have discrepancy between how you show up in motion, there's going to be kind of unconscious disconnect. Like if it's too different this time and it's different when it shows up in out of home as it does in social, you don't have that kind of authentic connection between you and your audience, or it's broken. It can become broken. So I guess if you're approaching motion, piecemeal per campaign, per deliverable, and you were using different motion designers, it's inevitable that would creep in, that disconnect. So I guess having a solid motion system in place that aligns with your design system and your kind of brand persona and your values just means that it's kind of part of this holistic whole that people probably don't see on a conscious level, but they just intuitively go, "Oh yeah, that feels like them again," you know. So it's that kind of recall as well, that familiarity.
Yeah, definitely. And again, you see it more and more in some of the brands that have really adopted this approach. I mean, sometimes to maybe the slightly more untrained eye, you don't necessarily notice it consciously, but once you start digging a little bit deeper, you can see that coherence and that consistency throughout everything they do, even to the point where it's even when it's slightly evolved, which obviously it has to do over time. It's still instantly recognizable in that brand, and obviously, people who kind of live and breathe it every day, like you and I, probably notice these things a little bit more. But I think it's really important to appeal to those people, the majority of our audience, I suppose, who are outside of that realm, who kind of engage with brands on maybe a slightly more passive basis, but still need that consistency to aid that recall. I mean, to me, that feels like that's the advantage of having a clear motion strategy, in terms of elevating the brand's overall impact. Is that fair to say as well?
Definitely, and I think you can raise an interesting thing about noticing it and it being almost invisible. I think the key is that it's not noticeable. That it doesn't stand. That it doesn't jar. So if you can build something that consistently delivers a very similar tone of voice through how you move, then you're kind of winning at it not being noticeably different each time. So it's not seeing the differences, which is kind of an important aspect of it for sure.
Yeah, yeah, and I kind of wanted to touch on this point about consistency as well,
Mm.
because we can say that we need to be consistent across different platforms, different channels, but like, to you and in your work, what's the key to actually doing that in terms of recognizing that certain channels and platforms are different? You mentioned out of home, for instance. You've got to grab people much more quickly, whereas certain other channels you might have a little bit more time of engagement, for instance.
Yeah.
So how do you actually start to build that consistency in when you do have different channels and different platforms that this stuff needs to live and breathe across?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? I think when I built the motion system with Skyscanner, we were thinking about all these touch points and how it all needs to add up. And I guess the key is to kind of keep it simple. You know, we have this kind of mantra about keeping it simple here, and like the simpler it is, the easier it is to constrain that consistency. You know, so um, there aren't too many edge cases. But it's an interesting thing about social. It's something that we talk about a lot. Is kind of that brand density in certain contexts. So something like digital out of home, or like it's a paid campaign, you can kind of go, okay, we can be really upfront with our branding. You know, it's not an organic piece, but maybe something like social, you know, where you have to feel a bit more authentic or native to the platform. You know, you have to consider how dense that brand or that motion is, so it doesn't disconnect people. Because I think, you know, within social platforms, we talk about this a lot. There's this kind of need for authenticity and for you to almost show up in that space like a, not as a brand, but as a kind of persona in its own right. So, yeah, we've been thinking about brand density quite a lot. So you can almost go, okay, for social is a good example. Like, I don't know, say you're doing a paid piece on social, you can be like 75% brand dense, but when you get down to doing reels, you could probably be about 12.5% brand dense. So it's like building out a system of, you know, templates or kind of a framework for allowing people to create content which has a nod to the original core heavily branded motion system, but is quite a light touch. So it could be as simple as just how the copy comes on and the color background, and making sure that the edges of that fill, you know, like in the social kind of copy, which has like a fill behind it, that the edging roundness matches your overall roundness in your brand. It could just be something as dense as that. Do you know what I mean? So it's not
Yeah.
full on brand, but there's just a nod to that design language further up the chain. But yeah, something that we've been thinking about a lot recently, actually, just how dense you show up as a brand through motion.
Yeah, that kind of term, brand density, is not something that we've really touched on too much on the podcast. But obviously, especially in this context, it's super important. And I think that certainly from our point of view, when we're looking at these things, the more granular that you can, or the more, I suppose, in a way, obsessive you can be about that stuff, the more that it kind of helps to build these motion systems, doesn't it? Because, you know, you're always thinking about context. You're always thinking about the way in which this content has to show up and the impact that it's going to have, you know, for each individual viewer, audience on each different platform. But yeah, I mean, do you guys use that kind of turn of phrase a lot internally? Brand density.
Not really. It's kind of something, I mean, I don't know where I kind of grasped that phrase from, but it was something I was thinking about when we were kind of beginning to talk about social a bit more, and having that awareness around, oh, we can't go full on brand in this in certain contexts. So it was like, it was just a word that maybe I just attached to, like how dense is it, you know? And it seemed to make sense to me. But I think it's something that brands should be considering, and I think people do. You know, when you look at all the touch points of brands, and you really examine, you know, where they show up, and you're able to like see a cross section of that, you're able to go, okay, that does make sense that on, I don't know, TikTok reel, you're just really not showing up that much as a brand, you know. Maybe it's just the color, and maybe not even the font, you know, maybe there's just the color, because you don't get that much native choice around your brand fonts, obviously. I mean, you could do, but as soon as people, there's this general sense that as soon as people sense that it's a brand, then it can be a little bit off-putting. So it's just having the awareness of that. But yeah, it's a useful term. I think it's one that I'm comfortable with using.
Yeah, I think we need to use it a bit more internally, to be honest. But also, you know, I love some people don't, but I kind of like the TikTokification of content, because it's really forced brands, especially, to look at, as you say, how you show up authentically on a platform like that, which, you know, as you mentioned, sometimes is very, very light density. You know, it's hardly any branding at all, because anything like that is just going to feel less authentic. And actually, this is kind of touching on a subject that I kind of want to move on to with you as well, which is, you know, that whole side of things for a lot of brands, especially brands that we tend to work with in our studio, kind of slightly more startup-y, scale-up-y kind of brands. That's so outside of their thinking. They're much more on a much more foundational kind of basic level, especially at startup stage. So I kind of wondered, to your mind, at what stage of brand development should teams, should businesses start thinking about motion, and even not necessarily motion systems per se, just how your brand should move? Because we speak to a lot of companies at certain stages, and they're just starting to think about it and just recognizing how important it is, but haven't really put any thought into it at all.
I mean, as soon as possible is what I would say. I think if you're working with a startup, you're given a gift, really, to help guide them not only in developing a design language, visual design language for their brand, but you might as well engineer that motion thinking in then as well. Like, I would say do it as soon as possible. I think obviously you need to hit the ground a little bit with the design, brand strategy, and obviously the design thinking, and then motion. But I think too many times people get that in place. They have, they have their brand tone of voice, they have their design system all laid out, and then they start again to think about motion. But it's kind of like, oh, I do think motion has a seat at the table and even influencing what the design language might be, because a lot more we're showing up through motion these days, as you know, and therefore the way we move might actually impact that original design language. So I think there just needs to be a bit more of an earlier on dialogue. I think it's really important. I think if you're in a great position if you're working with a new company or business which needs to help define that, it's brilliant. It's a brilliant time to be thinking about it right at the start. But yeah, it is challenging to get the client sometimes to actually see the value in that initially.
Yeah, I think it depends who the client is, to be honest. Sometimes, they're quite forward thinking and like to bring on a creative director, VP of creative early doors that maybe understands that a little bit more. Maybe if it's just the marketing team leading that side of things, I don't think there tends to be such value placed on it. But somewhere, I don't know if you've kind of seen this on your travels as well, but somewhere we've kind of seen a bit of an uptick is when we work on brand projects, and one of the outputs is brand guidelines, just having some basic motion guidelines in there as well. Nothing too strenuous, but just something that kind of illustrates. And we're not talking full systems here, as you were talking about earlier, but just some really, really basic kind of motion guidelines just to get the ball rolling, really. And sometimes that can be a quite nice way of doing things. I mean, yeah, what's your view on that in terms of, would you say that's a necessity, especially at certain stages, to have that kind of motion element built into brand guidelines?
I think so, but you don't have, like you say, you don't have to go like all in initially. You could, there's motion identity and then there's motion systems. So you could start with a motion identity. So, if you've been figuring out what their typography is like, what their branding in terms of their logo is like, you could start really simply, set some very simple rules around, okay, this is how type's going to move. And this is how the logo is going to work. And, this is how an end frame might work when you have to lock up a CTA with a logo. You could do something very simple around that. And it just depends on what their needs are and how they show up visually as a brand, I suppose. If they're very design orientated and you have to deliver a lot of motion within that visual world, then I would say you probably need to think about a motion system. But if you're very video led and it's more like you're telling stories through film and you just need to end up with a lockup and a kind of CTA, then maybe you just have more of a motion identity to begin with, and then it's something you build out later on. I mean, I would always push for building a system, but if it's a bit of an overreach and it's not required at that stage of the journey, especially for an early stage startup, then maybe it's something you make them aware of that needs to be done later, but you can start a bit simpler for sure.
Yeah, it's a good point. Every business is different. There are obviously similarities between certain types of business at certain stage, but fundamentally what their needs are does differ. So I think that's a really good point. I just wondered from your point of view, actually, what when you are building a motion system, particularly one that needs to be as robust as possible, what are the key components of that system? And then how do you actually approach the challenge of creating them? As we said before, different channels, different platforms, different contexts, and also getting them into a place where they're easily usable as well. So kind of documented
Yeah.
and accessible. It sounds like quite a complicated process. I mean, is it?
Yeah, it's quite well. I think it's just quite lengthy process, and I think it's too easy just to kind of jump in and start getting things moving. So my approach is to not use any motion to begin with, and actually just connect with the right people in the brand who know the brand, who have set out the kind of persona and the tone of voice of the brand, and actually get to grips with who we are as a company first. So, that can, I mean, the way we set it out at Skyscanner, for example, is like defining what the purpose of the motion is. Why are we building this motion system, and then looking at the kind of what those values should be. What should the motion uphold for the brand? So, in the case of Skyscanner, it was kind of, we want to feel optimistic, we want to feel inspiring, we want to inspire people to travel. We need to feel reliable, and we want to feel authentic in that kind of travel space. So you kind of hone in on those values and go, okay, well, this is a group of words, a language that we can start to think about and how that looks like in motion. So a lot of the time at the start of it was just exploring language and how that related to tone of voice and persona. And then from there, you can sort of build in, okay, well, what are the principles that we want to have for this? So it could be like consistency. You want to stay relevant. You want to be able to scale the motion across all these different touch points. You want to feel authentic. You want to have, you want to make sure that it's engaging, and you want to, delight people. Let's not forget about delighting people. It's all very well about thinking about consistency, but you do actually want to create an engaging, delightful experience as well. So it's kind of mapping that stuff out first. And then once you have those kind of values, principles, and purpose, that feels like a good kind of Venn diagram of kind of the foundations to build some motion. So we spent quite a lot of time just thinking about that stuff first before we even started looking at easing. But when you have those 4 words, optimistic, inspiring, reliable, authentic, you can start to look at, okay, well, what does that feel like with easing? What is that motion curve that could represent these words? So then you just start exploring what that feels like with easing. And then we're not even applying it to text. We're just taking like a simple graphic element, like a dot or something like that, and moving it and going, oh, does that feel the right tone? And then you kind of build up from there and you go, okay, well, that feels right. And we have about 20 different easing types with different variations that we were looking at. And you kind of move towards a certain thing that feels right. And then you can test it with like graphical elements like shapes, and then you can start to apply it to typography, and you can go, okay, what's the style that we can add to this easing? So are we, we're trying to be inspiring, so do we need to think about moving things upwards? So do we move the type up? So then you start to kind of dress the system from there, rather than starting with type and sort of getting that moving. You kind of start with language. I think that's a really good starting place. So yes, setting those foundations first, and then I guess from that you kind of scale it out, and it really does depend on the relationship to the overall visual design language of the brand. So making sure, you're probably already working with a design system, so it's kind of like, okay, how does photography move? How does video work? How do these elements all connect up in a composition, setting? And what is the relationship between those movements? So when you introduce a photograph, how does the text relate to that? Is the imagery driving the text, or is the copy driving the imagery? Do you know what I mean? What are those relationships that you can start to build? So then you kind of build out a framework for that. And at that stage, it's all very kind of explorative. You're sort of defining it. So you're getting to a point where you can kind of present this as a set of ideas to kind of the kind of stakeholders in the brand. And then once everyone's happy with how that's feeling, then you kind of roll it out and you kind of explore, okay, well, how does that feel in different formats or in different contexts, different touch points? What does it feel like for digital out of home? What does it feel like for social? And then you start to design those kind of more component aspects of the kind of motion system. And so that's kind of like the vision piece of how you would do it. And I guess from once you have all that locked and you start to like think about all these key touch points and surfaces where you'll show up, then you kind of do actual work of making it practical and accessible. So like that involves building After Effects templates, using essential graphics, writing scripts that you can reuse to make individual moments reusable and scalable and accessible to other motion designers, editors, etc. And so you build out all these kits. And this is a kind of living, breathing thing that's not just set in stone, you've done it. It's kind of like something that you keep adding to and expanding upon. And then off the back of that, once you have this kind of what you perceive as the useful kit of parts for the motion system, you can then write guidance on how to use that. So that's kind of the general journey. But it's never, I think the key thing with motion systems is to allow it to breathe as well. So you don't just go, right, this is how we move and that's it, we're done. It's like allowing for creative to have a voice in that as well. So, okay, maybe we need to tweak that in this context. And it's a kind of learning, growing, breathing thing. And I think that's important, to not necessarily let it strangle the creative, but allow it, create a context where it's kind of agnostic to the creative, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It's sort of allowing the creator to have a voice. I don't know if that makes sense or answers your question, but it's quite a big,
completely.
It's a big one.
No, it is, and I can just imagine any motion designers listening to this frantically scribbling down notes and pressing rewind and going back and making sure they've got that all down, because I think that's super valuable advice. And I was just wondering, as you were speaking then about talking about it, making it a living, breathing thing, does that also extend to the way that it continually has to evolve as well? Because as you know, you don't get to an end point and go, right, motion system done, here we go, let's move on to something else, because things change, especially in the world that we live in, and to a certain extent you operate in as well. Digital world, fast moving, things are changing. A lot of clients we work with, priorities can change from week to week. The brand sometimes, not well, as little as possible, but sometimes has to flex with that, and sometimes that is the brand identity as well. Has to be tweaked, different audiences, different platforms, different approaches to different platforms. So how do you approach the challenge of making sure that it has enough room for creative experimentation, evolution, and to a certain extent boundary pushing as well?
Yeah, I think that's really important consideration. I think we have a couple of different approaches to the kind of work that we build. I'm just talking about Skyscanner here, where we have an ongoing campaigns that are running, which are definitely more led by creative ideation. And then we have the more kind of lower funnel paid kind of work, which is more kind of that, okay, well, that's our kind of, we can really lean into the motion system for that stuff. And we know we've got these templates and the system for how we would approach that. And that does change. And we try to kind of refresh that, like quarterly, every half year. We kind of run cycles of deliverables around paid stuff, for example. But then, in the campaign work, you can kind of, you've got to allow space for the creative. So I guess what we tend to do is kind of definitely bring the easing in, definitely bring when typography is coming in, or we're using imagery or framing imagery in a certain way. Okay, we know that we can subtract that from the motion system, but we might just need to build kind of like a new system to support that, like a subsystem of the main one, but you're definitely drawing the core principles of our motion, like definitely our easing, definitely all our timings, the choreography of how things move. So you kind of apply that to the creative, but sometimes it doesn't necessarily work in the way that it's worked before. So you do have to modify it, but as long as you've got those core fundamentals that are invisible, like easing and timing and choreography, and typography, those core elements are still relating back to that foundation. And I think there's quite a lot of flexibility in there for the creative to kind of lead a bit more.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, listen, Peter, thank you so much for joining me on the Changemakers today, episode number 50. I think there's so much sage advice in there for any motion designers, aspiring motion designers, and anyone out there, and I'm sure there's a few of you listening to this, that that motion needs to be incorporated into your brand identity in a more sustainable, long-term, systematic way, but haven't quite figured it out. So much advice in here for you there.
Oh,
Do go follow Peter on LinkedIn, check out Skyscanner and the amazing stuff they put out on a daily basis. But other than that, Peter, thank you so much for being an amazing guest on the Changemakers with me today.
Dave, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.